going. And so glad to have you all here again, and we'll keep plowing through, just like last week, a slight adjustment to schedule based upon pacing. And so I think today we're going to shoot to get through to the question of where the New Testament came from. So we're definitely a few weeks at this point behind what I originally set up, or maybe it's just 1 week, but that's what we're going to be looking at. I think that I'm getting a sense of what's realistic in terms of covering in 1 hour. And so next week we'll see if we can get to both the question of who chose what books go into the Bible and why there's so many translations. I think we might be able to fit those two together. And so that's what we're shooting for anyways next week. But today our question is, how did the New Testament come together? Last week we talked about the Old Testament similarly, and this is sort of where we landed with this conversation that was about truth versus fact and the difference there. And the assertion that the primary biblical concern is conveying meaning and significance and truth, not factual accuracy. That the Bible can be profoundly true and not historically factual. So when we find places where the Bible is not historically factual, we can still assert as Christians that it is true. Because it's getting at a truth that's deeper than that factual level. And with that, the Bible does not need to be factually accurate in order to be God's truth. So that's the point that we landed at, and we're going to use that to keep going into the New Testament here. So starting with the Gospels. And this is what the Gospels have to actually say about themselves and their goal. So Luke tells us right at the beginning of his gospel, I too decided after investigating everything carefully from the first to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. So that's Luke laying out his intention there so that you may know the truth. And John puts this a little later near the end of his gospel. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, so it has that sort of summary feel, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that through believing you may have life in his name. So Luke and I would say John even more explicitly really come clean about what they're trying to do with their writing here. What they're trying to convey. Welcome. Howdy. What they're trying to convey and the purpose of their writing is so that you may come to believe. That's why John's writing John's gospel. That's the purpose. That's the primary goal, and they're upfront about that being their agenda. And I would just note that that's the primary agenda, not just giving a historically accurate account to relay exactly what happened, the facts, as it were. They're trying to again get at this deeper truth about who they believe that Jesus is, and to pass that on so that others may believe it as well. Another note just about Luke is he acknowledges, and we're going to come back around this, that there are all sorts of other accounts going about, and that's the sort of starting point. I also decided, because he notes in the verse before, there are many about. So they're not the only ones out, and John will also note has all of these other things that are written, and this is sort of acknowledging that he had to pick and choose, and he also gives us the criterion there for how he was picking and choosing based upon what he was trying to do, so that you may come to believe. So we can think of this through and say, well, John was picking and choosing based upon what he imagined would be most compelling in his aim for the people who are his audience, who are reading his gospel, to come to believe. That's what he's trying to do, what the purpose is. So, if we think about what this is, there's the agenda, and all sorts of scholars and academics have tried to figure out, all right, how does the Gospels that we have, compare to other ancient literature? What might be comparable here? And this is what they said. This is coming from, I added another book to my reading list for this week. It's just called The Fortress Introduction to the Gospels, so it's focused on these texts specifically. But what Paul says, Mark Allen Powell, is that the Gospels are probably most similar to ancient biographies. They're not like modern biographies, for they make no pretense of offering an objective or balanced perspective of Jesus' life. Just note that line alongside like what John is saying about his helping us to believe. They do not reveal their source, and their treatment is far from comprehensive. They offer little insight into Jesus' personality or motivation, provide almost no information about his early life, and do not even bother to describe his physical appearance. Such matters, however, were not expected to be addressed in biographies of this period. And so, if we actually read through the gospel, we don't get much of a biography of Jesus in terms of a whole lot of aspects of his life. We've probably noticed that. There's just a whole lot of empty space there because it fits with the goal that we've talked about in the way of John's aim and the aim of these kind of ancient biographies, which isn't to necessarily give the fullest picture with as many possible details or facts as they can sort of jam into a biography. It's to lead you in a direction of, in John's case, believing that Jesus is the Messiah. Again, they make no pretense of offering an objective or balanced perspective on Jesus' life. And so coming back to John's quote here, so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Son of God. And it's why we can refer to the gospel writers as evangelists. They're not biographers, they're not historians, they're evangelists because of this goal that they have, the why behind their writing, so that you may come to believe. And so we do talk about them as evangelists. And when we think about what they're doing, how they're actually going through this process, they're really functioning in kind of three different ways, as curators, editors, and authors. And so John notes at the beginning, as we said, that there are also many other things that Jesus did. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. So there's this massive compilation. There are clearly other stories about Jesus that are floating around. None of the gospel writers are trying to write down and include everything that they've maybe gathered up along the way that they possibly could. And so Luke acknowledges there's these other writers out there. John's saying we've got all of these additional stories that are floating around. And so on the first level, they're gathering it. Luke, if you recall from that opening quote, says, I did a careful investigation. He's going around looking into what's out there, collecting the stories of Jesus, because Luke himself notes that he wasn't an eyewitness to these events. So on one level, they're first starting by, their gathering stuff. Scholars believe that when the four evangelists incorporated material into their gospels, so they're drawing the stuff, then they're incorporating it in. They edited the material, so there we've got editors again. So they're taking what they have, they're editing it, presumably along the lines of kind of their primary goal of evangelism, as well as the unique concerns that each of the gospel writers have. They edited the material, and then they added their own commentary. So that's where we get the author piece there. So what we're looking at in the way of this process is this collection of different materials that are floating around, a lot of it oral in the first place, and then stuff eventually starts getting written down. And then the individual evangelists are taking this material, and they're editing it in a variety of different ways. Sometimes the specific content, sometimes it's more how it gets arranged. And then they're kind of writing things around it to fill in the space, to do their transitions, and to make some of the unique points that they have. Today, material in the Gospels that is thought to derive from a source, oral or written, so what they're gathering, is identified as tradition. So tradition we can kind of think of as the stuff that's just floating around in the water. That's in there, it's moving through the churches, it's being preached, it's being passed on by all sorts of storytellers, it's moving around. So just assume that it's being stored among the Christian communities, it's being passed on, it's getting passed on initially from the apostles and then spreading out from there. And material that is thought to have been added by evangelists is called the framework. So they're taking all of this stuff that's common to the people, that's just moving around through the different churches, primarily by word of mouth, getting talked about. They're taking all of that common knowledge, and then they're framing it in their own unique ways. And so as it plays out within our Gospels, there are stories that we find in all of these different Gospels. So you can think of that as the tradition and assume that these were stories that were just being passed on, and they were talked about in the different church communities, and it's just moving about, and so that's in the tradition, and thus it's accessible to all of these different evangelists. But then they're taking this tradition and they're putting it within their own framework. They're doing the editorial and authoring work of arranging them to make their points in sort of different ways. And so we look and have some of the same stories in different places. Like Jesus does the whole turning over the temple thing, right? But depending upon which gospel you're reading, it's either at the very beginning of his ministry or it's at the very end of his ministry. Possible that it happened twice, and people that are concerned with biblical literalism and reading it that way, will try and argue this. But from our perspective here, we're more just looking at it, all right, that was a story. And presumably, it's rooted in truth. It was passed on, and so it happened. But then they're taking the story and they're arranging it in different ways as they see to be, as they think is most compelling. That is going to serve their primary purpose of helping the people that they're writing to believe, whatever order or arrangement sort of it might be in. So they're constructing it with these materials that are out there, gathering and providing this framework. And we can see that a little bit in sort of when we get into some specific examples. So when we talk about the Gospels, scholars have long observed that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have a whole lot of similarities, a whole lot of shared context between the three of them. And so we talk about those three as the synoptic Gospels. That's the term that you've coined to talk about those three. And then we have John, and John's kind of off doing his own thing. But you have these three that are very much in relation. And this is one of the hypotheses of the leading one that's the majority of scholars are on board with at the moment. But it is a hypothesis of kind of how these things relate, these three synoptic Gospels. And so what we're looking at here is Mark is the oldest of the Gospels, dated to about 70 AD. So the first of the Gospels that we have access to be written down is Mark. And basically what we get in Mark, if you read through the Gospels, it's the shortest. It's 16 chapters long, so not particularly long. And if you read it, it's bang, 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 bang. Mark says things like immediately. I've heard it described, the Gospel of Mark, as like a comic book where you're just flipping through and it's scene after scene after scene and it's all action. What is notably not particularly present in Mark, if you read it, particularly in comparison to the other Gospels, is a whole bunch of teaching. Mark doesn't have a Sermon on the Mount or a Sermon on the Plain in it. That, if you're looking at what's going on in Mark's Gospel and what's not there compared to the longer Gospels, a lot of it is these extended teachings that's just not there. So in Matthew, you have the Sermon on the Mount that's 3 chapters long, Matthew 5 through 7, and none of that is in Mark. Or maybe there's a few bits sprinkled throughout, but Matthew just has it as this block of teaching that's just not there. Now, where we also find it, however, is in Luke. So what we're seeing when we're looking at, and what this diagram is trying to show, is that when you look at Matthew and Luke's gospel, what you see is that the narrative, the story for the most part, follows the same line as Mark. They're including most of the same stories. It's following the same basic progression going through. And so the hypothesis is that Matthew and Luke both had access to Mark's gospel. The overlap is so compelling that sometimes it seems like it's copy and pasted from Mark's gospel into Matthew and Luke. And sometimes between the three of them, they are all very, very, very close. And so we look at the three and say, gosh, this seems like it's more than coincidence that there's this level of parallelism. And so we look at that and say, all right, Matthew and Luke have this connection with Mark. And Mark is this storyline. And so Mark provides kind of the narrative spine, if you will, that Matthew and Luke are built around, both of them. But what we find in Matthew and Luke then is that they actually share things in common, like the Sermon on the Mount. They are different, but you have significantly parallel teachings. They put it in different places. So you can think about what that means, that Matthew, it's the Sermon on the Mount. Maybe that has something to do, scholars would suggest, or maybe even insist, with the idea of it being of the Ten Commandments, and the commandments being given to Moses on the Mount, and that being where Jesus is placed to draw the parallel to Moses and the teachings that follow coming from that place. It'd be another one where maybe the concern isn't geography there primarily, and getting the facts of exactly what the terrain was like as this theological point connecting Jesus to Moses. But I digress. The point there is that we have these teachings in Matthew and Luke that overlap, and we see this multiple times, particularly around teachings that exist in those two, but not in Mark, so clearly they're not drawing it from Mark. The hypothesis is that there was another source out there that both Matthew and Luke had access to, and were drawing this shared material from. And that's been called the Q source. So this Q source is hypothetical. It's theorized. And the Q source then is composed of all of these teachings, these things that we see in Matthew and Luke, but not in Mark. So the theory is that you've got that Matthew and Luke have access to Mark and Q, in addition to other oral tradition that was out there. And they're using those two sources to compose and gather for their gospels. So if we think about kind of that progression, and I said, you start as curators. And so Matthew and Luke, they're curating from Mark and Q and maybe some other sources. And then they're editing it, so we have slight differences, like Matthew puts it on a mount and Luke puts it on a plain. Who knows what the original setting may have been. So they're making their slight edits there, but they're still so comparable that we see them as being from a similar source, likely. And then they're adding their own bits around. And so you have, that was just Luke. It's Luke's authorial bits that he's adding in, and then is Matthew. And so they're gathering the sources, they're editing it to put their gospel together, and then they're writing around it to give it focus, to transition. As you imagine, you've got to do some work to smooth things out and simply to make it in a nice, readable narrative type of way. When you're gathering things from all sorts of different places, part of the work is smoothing it out and making it so that you actually want to read it. And so that's part of their work that we've got going there. And I think that we can assume that Mark is following a similar process, but maybe at that point, there's nothing written down. He may be going through that same process, but it's entirely from oral tradition. Or maybe there was something else written down that we no longer have access to. But I think likely it's going on as entirely from oral tradition. He's listening to people, he's visiting churches, and he's collecting all of these stories, and then as he's writing it down, he's making edits, or likely there's probably different versions of the same story that's being passed around, and then he's writing around it to make it fluid, so that you actually read it and it has this feel of bing, bing, bing. You flip through Mark's gospel, and probably imagine that John's working similarly, but John's a little bit trickier because we don't have these parallels to look at the way that we do with the synoptic gospels. But that's a little bit what we can imagine is going on there. And so looking at this, I want to sort of look at some specific texts, and because and how that then ends up playing out again. I gave you the sermons as an example. Here's a small one, and an example of kind of what we see in a story that exists in all four of the Gospels. And this is the betrayal and arrest of Jesus. I had to pick something small that I could pick on a slide, fit on a slide. So there are much more prominent, bigger, and even clearer examples than this one. But this is a story that appears in all four Gospels. Increasingly, as you get up to the Passion narrative, a lot of the events we'll find in all four Gospels, where in a lot of Jesus' earlier ministries, there's more of a gap and more distance between the Gospels. But at this point, it's all happening. Now, I'm going to give you a second to read those, and just notice. See what you notice.
Oh, thank you.
All right, what do you notice? Any observations?
Judas, one of the 12, is repeated 3 times.
Judas, one of the 12. Judas, one of the 12. Indeed. And which 3 times?
Mark, Matthew, Luke.
Wow, that sounds kind of like what I was saying about those 3 being, sort of connected. So what do we notice about John then?
Really descriptive.
It's really descriptive. I mean, if you're looking at the 4 of these, you got significant overlap. You can see the connection between these 3, right? And then you got John, who's telling the story, but John has his own flavor. John's gonna do his thing. There's some humorous memes out there that kind of make this point. If you want to dig around on the internet, you can find some humorous memes commenting on sort of the uniqueness of John relative to these. But John has this tendency to have a lot of flavor and a lot of color in his work, and we can kind of see this in this little bit. But you can also see how, all right, you can see some connection between these 3. How they could be working with the same things, then, well, this is different. But clearly they still all have access to the same tradition. So we have this story that's moving around that John had heard, even as he's writing it very differently, as had Matthew, Mark, and Luke in some way. But it was just among this larger tradition that probably everyone in the churches, plural would be a better way to talk about all of these different communities that are scattered, that it was just out there, that people knew this story. And so we find it in all these, even as they end up looking very different. All right, so those are some big obvious differences. What else do you notice?
Mark was a lot easier to read.
Mark was a lot easier to read.
It seems to have a better it seems to, the flow. Yeah, the flow's a lot better in Mark than in Matthew Luke gives us very little information.
Short to the point.
Yes. Matthew gives us more information than Luke does, but Mark gives us the most information with the best payoff.
Mm-hmm.
And as well as it offers more, whether it's true or not, the extension of the one I will kiss is the man, arrest him and lead him away under guard,
Mm-hmm.
which is absent from Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
I thought was really nice, that it added more.
And it's interesting to think about this if we assume that Mark is the oldest, and this is kind of how the scholarly work. Now that you're all, biblical study students, like the process here is, all right, so Mark wrote this, and then we start asking questions like, well, why did Matthew change this? Why did Luke cut out this whole chunk there? What was going on? Why did they do that, and what does that tell us about the unique confession that this gospel writer is trying to make? They're sharing these same stories, but they each have their distinctive concerns, the distinctive aspect of Jesus that they're trying to lift up for their community, because they each are still writing to people that are unique communities with unique concerns. And in the same way we talked about this throughout the Old Testament, they're writing with these people in mind and writing to help them. Not in a universal sense, but we're starting with an actual community with specific issues and concerns with culture and conflict. And that's who all of these authors are writing to, at least not the same ones, but different ones. And that's part of why, they end up with their, sort of distinct confessions. But we look at the differences, and that's where we get some insights into what's going on here. And it's by asking questions, and a lot of times that's it. The work is asking questions, and we do our best, but it's more questions than answers. It's drawing conclusions from the empty spaces, as opposed to having it put right in front of us.
Funny, Matthew, Mark, and Luke all begin with, well, he was still speaking.
Mm-hmm.
And John says, after he had spoken.
Mm-hmm. And it's another space where it's tough here because I'm giving you very limited context, and so it's surrounding. So part of that is going to be just the way that they're placed differently. But yes, I mean, and just if we're looking at sort of the difference, those are the questions. I mean, and then we can look at something like, why did Luke not have that in there? Or if we're looking at John and look at some of the more dramatic, in some ways John's easy because the differences are obvious. Like one of them being, notice who comes and arrests Jesus in these. A large crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. They do come. Luke gives us a little early on, like they show, he rearranges things a little bit differently so it doesn't parallel, which is why I didn't have it up here. But there was a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests, the scribes, and the elders. I mean, even that little note, like why would Matthew have removed the scribes? Slight tweak, but they're close enough that it seems like that was clearly a choice that Matthew made, right? If he had Mark, he had this. For some reason, he decided, no, I'm going to scratch the scribes off of my list. We can only theorize about what that, made about. Maybe writing 10 years later, which is kind of where we tend to place Matthew, the scribes were a relevant faction. That particular group didn't mean anything to the people that he was writing to, and he sort of said, well, no need to include that. I don't know that. That's just a theory, but that's kind of how we imagine it. But if you look at who comes to arrest John, so Judas brought a detachment of soldiers together with police from the chief priests and the Pharisees, and they came there with lanterns and torches and a wedge. John throws in about 200 soldiers. No, I mean, that's literal. A detachment is about that large. John just throws 200 Roman soldiers into the narrative. Why? That's the beauty of this biblical interpretation work. Why? What kind of point is John making? Now, my reading of it is what I see is you end up with this very intimate setting in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the kiss is very prominent there. It's this betrayal from an intimate. In John, it's not this intimate setting, it is this massive confrontation between Jesus. And John is the one where they say, who's Jesus? And Jesus says, I am. Not I am the one, I am, quoting the divine name. Yahweh, that's what it translates to. And what happens in John's narrative is this whole company, so 200 Roman soldiers plus all of these people fall down to their knees in front of Jesus. That's a very different image that John is painting from this intimate betrayal of a little group of police with clubs that are coming to arrest him. It is this massive confrontation between Jesus and empire. And that's one of the distinctive things about John. Another example is who carries Jesus' cross when it comes to that time? Anyone?
Him.
A dude, what's his name? Peter, right? It's a different dude named Peter.
No.
No?
Well, sort of. Almost. Simon of Cyrene. So Simon Peter. So it's like,
sure.
But the thing about it is, you're both right. Because in John, Jesus carries his own cross. And John is very specific about saying he carried his own cross, which makes me think that he probably knew that there were stories out there about someone helping Jesus carry his cross. But for some reason, John wanted to be very clear that Jesus could carry his own cross and he didn't need no help from nobody. And that is kind of the portrayal that John has of Jesus throughout. John begins, in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh. John has this very high understanding of Jesus as God, a higher level of divinity than the synoptic gospels do. And that then appears in different ways, like the scene, like Jesus carrying his own cross. We can see that throughout, and it's again another place where we look at these differences. We look at the unique choices that these different evangelists made as they are editing and adding to their narratives. And that tells us a lot about their particular faith, their unique beliefs that they're confessing. And so that's kind of the process that we look at. And I'm going to give you another example here. You've already gotten a little bit of those sort of contradictions, but this one may blow your mind a little bit. When was Jesus crucified?
33?
30.
No, not age. When was he Jesus? When it's like, what day?
Good Friday.
Of course! Good Friday, right? Did you realize that the Gospels actually provide different days and times for when Jesus was crucified? Here it is for you. Here it is. So this is Mark, and Matthew and Luke naturally agree with Mark. On the first day of unleavened bread, note that, first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, his disciples said to him, "Where do you want us to go and make preparations for you to eat the Passover?" All right, so this is the day they're coming into Jerusalem, right? It's the first day of unleavened bread, the day that you make preparations for the Passover. That part's significant. The day that you make preparations, that's like when you gather the lamb and you slaughter the lamb and do that. Then the narrative goes on, and we get that night is the Last Supper. And then they go to Gethsemane, and Jesus is arrested, and all of that's taking place. Now, important to note here that in the first century Jewish timekeeping, and actually still today, the day runs sundown to sundown, not sunrise to sunrise. So, this is really, if we imagine this is taking place during the day, by the evening, we've started a new day. So this is no longer on the first day of unleavened bread. This is the next day. It's no longer the day before the Passover, it's Passover, when the sun sets. And then when the next morning comes, it's still that same day as it was the night before, since the sun sets. So we're still on Passover. So day before Passover, and then Passover, and so it goes on, everything. There's the whole Pilate. Jesus is arrested, to Jesus is tried. Jesus, is ultimately taken to the cross, and it was 9 o'clock in the morning when they crucified him on Passover. Because this was the day before Passover, now he's crucified on Passover. Let's take a look at John. Now, it was the day of preparation for the Passover, right? So we got that, the day of preparation for the Passover. That was this day up here. And it was about noon, then Pilate handed over to them to be crucified. See, different day. This is the day, this is the same day as here. It's not the Passover, it's the day before Passover. John has Jesus crucified a day before Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And at noon, as opposed to 9 o'clock in the morning.
Is there a real difference in those times? Like, given the area this took place in, right? Is there any real legitimate difference between those times, or is it one of those things where you approximate in the sky and you're like, it's probably like this time?
I mean, my general knowledge of first century solar patterns in Palestine is pretty limited, but generally noontime you got the sun up in the sky. I mean, and that's a pretty recognizable point. But I mean, we can look at that as far as a pretty small difference. I mean, in any case, we've got some time here. So this is where he's getting handed over to be crucified. And then he bowed his head and gave up his spirits. This is presumably hours later. And again, here we've got, since it was the day of the preparation. So still, they don't agree on what day Jesus was crucified. You ever hear that before? No? All right. Now, it is John. Now you're starting to sound like biblical scholar there. It is John. That's but this is the work here. Now, if we're to go back to where we started, night one, if we're concerned about biblical literalism and the facts in the Bible all being 100% accurate, about it being infallible and inerrant to bring those words back, this is a huge problem. You can't say that this is a small discrepancy. There are other things that are, small discrepancies and you can maybe shrug off. But this is not a small thing at this point. So if that's your posture on the Bible, as it's perfect, infallible, inerrant, this is a pretty significant problem to have to work your way through. If, however, we recognize, and as we've talked about, that the real concern is not where it came from in this perfect sense, it's what it does. That's how it is the Word of God. It's what God does with it. And on the level of the authors, they're concerned with what it does, the truth that they're trying to convey, rather than getting all of the facts accurate. Well, if we're operating on that level, then the question isn't who's got it right. It's let's assume for a moment that John was the one that switched it, because it's John. Now, we have no reason to believe that it was him one way or the other, but let's just assume for the moment that it's John, and he decided, I'm going to put it on, preparation for the Passover day. Why would he make that choice? That's the question that it becomes, that we're engaging with. Not who's right. Why did John decide to do this? What was he trying to tell us about Jesus? Colby, you got an answer?
It is narratively more dramatic.
It is narratively more dramatic. I have no doubt that they made some choices just in the way of narrative drama and being engaging for the people. But I think there's more going on here. It sort of is up there. You can see it. What goes on the day of preparation for the Passover? Apart from Jesus maybe or maybe not dying on that day. But within the general practice, what goes on the day of preparation?
Sorry, so just clarification. John says it happened on the preparation day, and then Mark
Passover?
says... Yeah.
Preparation day,
Yeah.
day before
Okay,
Passover.
okay.
Yeah.
Passover is a regular time and that happens in the Jewish calendar.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Like every week, every day?
Annual.
Annual.
Yep, and it goes back to the Exodus. It's the Passover when they passed over the firstborn children of Israel as the firstborn children of Egypt were slaughtered. That's the Passover, the celebration of how God passed over the children of Israel. So major celebration within Judaism. So you can understand why, let's line it up with that as a significant event. That makes sense. But why would John make this slight tweak? Again, the question is, what happens, and your answer is within the verses, on the day of preparation?
The whole, he is the Lamb of God, right? And then so he's the one being prepared.
Bingo. On the first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover lamb is sacrificed, it's the day of preparation. That's the day that the lamb is sacrificed. John's moving, I think this is what's going on. John's moving the crucifixion to the day of preparation to make the point that Jesus is the Lamb. Jesus is the Lamb of God, who's sacrificed so that God will pass over our sins. We can see very clearly sort of this being a case where, you can see that's a pretty powerful witness that John's going for there. And it's one of those places where you can just see John saying, it is more important for me to drive this point home than it is that I get the exact 24-hour day right. And I think that, I don't believe that any of these, authors are just recklessly throwing the facts around and changing things just for the sake of it. I think they're doing it with intention and purpose. All of that purpose pointed towards the aim that we talked about in the way of leading the people to believe that Jesus was the Messiah.
I don't understand when they get the big difference between 9 o'clock and noon.
That I have no theories on. There's probably someone out there, if I ever dig something up, I will let you know. But I don't know why the timing is different. I would guess that there is a reason for it. I don't know. And then of course, it's possible and probable in some, if not many cases, that these are oral traditions, and maybe there were multiple traditions, and so maybe depending upon where you were getting your story, you were getting slightly different details. That could be it too. It's not an effort at deception. It's not a mistake. It's just a matter that you had slightly different details that's tweaked over the course of this story being passed on and passed on. Because Mark, even by the first, he's 40 years writing after Jesus dies. So
I was going to say, it was, they tend to write the Bible, apparently, that Christ died at noon, or that's the one they tend to use. And then the cloud turned dark. You don't usually do that in the morning.
yeah, I mean,
it seems but it's,
Isn't there somewhere where it says that? And the earth shook and all, isn't that about 3 o'clock in the afternoon?
I'm trying to remember. There is a 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and that sounds right, but they're blurring in my head. I'm trying to the times and what happens when and in which gospels. But that would be the thing to look at. I mean, when I think reading the Bible gets fun and interesting, when you start going in and you can say, all right, well, what did Crazy John say? You know, what does his crucifixion account look like? And then you can go back and you can look. It's like, gosh, I mean, I don't remember. I honestly don't. But, you know, based upon the nature of John, it wouldn't surprise me if John's the one that throws an earthquake in there. Like, that's his style. That's kind of his role. So maybe not, but...
maybe more of a orator, or more of a writer, you know, that
yeah.
adds a little color.
I mean, you also have to think that fundamentally there's the storytelling, there's the agenda, there's the people that they're writing to, context, but there's also just the authors. That they've got their own personalities, their own way of talking and writing. I mean, the same way that preachers today, you know, can say the same thing and we're going to say it in very different ways. You know, it's going to be presented differently. We talked about kind of that medium piece last week, that you had the event and the significance and then the medium that conveys it. Part of the medium is the person. You know, whoever is using, you know, you've got the writers, but part of the medium is also, you've got the language, I mean, but part of the medium is also the particular writer and what they're doing, and they bring parts of themselves to it. So just to wrap up the Gospels here, Christian communities probably were concerned about confusion, particularly when we look at these, you know, contradictions. You know, it's actual contradictions. There's just contradictions in the Bible. But they felt that on the whole, the truth about Jesus was too deep, too rich to be captured in any single portrait, so they lived with the occasional confusion 4 versions created, because taken together, those 4 Gospels offer a more complete picture of the truth about Jesus than any of them could offer alone, or even a harmonized version of all 4 could offer. What believers then and now really need isn't a summary of details, but a living confession of faith. So we've got 4 Gospels to get at this deeper confession of faith. And this is jumping ahead a slight bit, but just note that that's the early Christian community living with the confusion, because their concern is not, you know, making sure that there's no inconsistencies. I think in your book it talked about there was at one point someone that tried to create a harmonized version that sort of blended them together, and then that didn't take hold. Because they would rather have, the community was better served by these different perspectives and the way that the differences actually created a fuller picture. Rather than creating confusion, especially if we're able to read it with the understanding that we're working towards, you know, it provides us a greater depth, you know, a fuller picture of who Jesus was and what Jesus did and what Jesus means for creation. But we've gotten a little ahead of ourselves, because the Gospels were not actually the first thing written in our New Testament text. Here's a little thing. You've got this on in your book on page 43, a chart similar like that one that we had in the Old Testament, but I put it up here in something. And all of these dates are there's some estimation and disagreement among scholars among some of these things. Notably here, like, this was a Marcus Borg one, who's got the one book that I read. You know, and he pins Luke 1:10 in the 110s, which is super late, whereas the majority of scholars, I think, would still put him right up here around Matthew. So this is not a certain type of thing. The one thing that I would note, however, is that this is a pretty small span of time when we compare it to the Old Testament, right? The amount of time it's covered in the events and the authorship and the editing and all of that stuff to bring these books together. This is, you know, less than a century that we're talking about here. Jesus dies in the 30s, but then we move into the first books that we actually have, and we start with Paul. Our oldest texts are Paul's letters. The oldest, it's generally agreed, is 1 Thessalonians. So 1 Thessalonians is actually the oldest book that we have. in the Bible. And so when we think about Jesus' stories, just as a note, they're circulating, like I said, for 40 years before they start to get written down. And just to imagine why that timing might have been significant, that would have been about the time where a lot of those apostles that knew Jesus and were walking around and had that first-hand eyewitness accounts were starting to die. They didn't live all that long back then, and while they were probably actually younger than we may think, when they're called, at least the writing was probably on the wall where people were thinking, wow, these guys that are giving us these stories that experienced this with Jesus are starting to look pretty old and frail. Maybe we should jot some of these things down so the stories don't get lost. And so it's probably almost certainly not the actual apostles who wrote them down, in spite of the names that some of our Gospels have. Particularly if you think of how many of the disciples were fishermen that would not have been literate or able to write things down. They wouldn't have been equipped for that. But probably not them writing it down, but people that would have heard them. And I think that their death or imminent death was probably a significant driving force for someone thinking, Mark or someone else, we should write some of this stuff down. This is important, so let's put it down. But all of that isn't happening until later, and by the time we're getting to that point, we have communities that are established, because that's what Paul's doing. And when we look at Paul's letters, that's what they are. They're letters to church communities. So the church communities are forming in the first place. They're getting their messages, and they're growing without a written version of the gospel. Maybe there's small things written around that are getting passed or something. But certainly there's nothing that we have today that suggests that there was something written down and older that, was a full, complete gospel in some way. So all of these little churches that Paul and others are planting are operating with primarily oral tradition. And we start jumping back with Paul's letters.
Paul didn't write both 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, did he?
That is a great question with a slightly less than clear answer. So, Paul, obviously important. This is what Mark says. Next to Jesus, Paul's the most important individual in the birth of the Christian movement. And, one thing that ends up being unique about the New Testament compared to the Old Testament, and a lot of this is because of how compact it is individuals, individual authors, individual evangelists, had far more influence, someone like Paul, as one person, than when you think about the Old Testament forming over centuries and centuries, generations and generations being passed on. And so in that sense, it matters more who Paul was as an individual than any of the individuals we might find in the Old Testament, simply because Paul's writing all this stuff. We have his language, his words, and so having some understanding of Paul, is significant. So, getting to your question about letters, 1 Thessalonians, Galatians, 1 and 2 Corinthians, Philemon, Philippians, Romans. 7 letters, scholars, general consensus, Paul wrote. That's the general consensus. Colossians, Ephesians, 2 Thessalonians. That's where there's conversation. And a fair amount of disagreement. I would say that the slight majority leans towards probably not. But that's an ongoing conversation. Notably, these 3 letters they claim to be written by Paul. But question of whether it's so. 2 Thessalonians, depends who you ask, whether Paul wrote it or not. And then you've got 1 and 2 Timothy and Titus, who also claim to be written by Paul. If you actually read the letters, they all have Paul at the beginning. And the general consensus, probably apart from biblical literalists that doesn't really work within their frame of understanding the Bible to say Paul didn't write this, is that Paul didn't write these 3. They say it's written by Paul, but most scholars would say no, not those 3. But what we can certainly look at is whether he wrote these 6 or not. The fact that someone in the later tradition was writing his name on it tells you something about how significant and influential Paul was within the early Christian community. That they were putting his name on it because of the credibility that Paul brought with him. Whether he wrote it or not speaks to how significant Paul is as a figure. Yeah?
Doesn't that also mean that those 6 are liable to errors? That would not, because if they potentially aren't actually Paul's words, and they just slap Paul on there. Like if I slapped some high grade student in my class, and I slapped their name on my essay, just so it, I mean, they get credit, but still.
Well, I mean, what we see, and the reason that most scholars question these, is that there are significant differences in writing style, in theology. There's, and of course people can change, so that could be part of it. Maybe Paul evolved. In these spaces in between, that's people have to make that argument because there are differences, but the perspective seems to be different. So that's part of it, and not Paul. Now, but the question then is, within the context of thinking of this as scriptures, the Word of God is inspired by God, we, say as Christians that Paul was inspired, thus we have his letters here, but not more so than these other authors. And so, in terms of the question, does it make them any less credible because they're not written by Paul? I would say no. They're just not written by Paul. They're written by someone else who was inspired by God.
So I don't know much about it, but I'm kind of either seeing parallels or choosing these parallels. But like Socrates, there's no works written by him, but Plato writes in the viewpoint of Socrates, sort of kind of thing.
Yep, and that's where it was a pretty common practice, that type of thing. It wasn't viewed as being, it was actually viewed as being more honoring the person than it was like plagiarizing the person. And so, putting Paul's names on that was not something that, the people reading would be like, oh my gosh, you're trying to trick me. That wouldn't have been the reaction of people in the ancient world. So it is different in that sense. But to keep going a little bit on Paul and watching the clock here, so we're going to rush a little bit. This is what Paul says about himself. And we get a couple witnesses. He says this in Galatians, talks a little bit about his earlier life as persecuting the church and his zeal as for the traditions of Judaism, and kind of leading into both of those points there. We also have information from the book of Acts. Paul's a major figure there, and so we get a lot of stories about Paul in the book of Acts, but sometimes they don't actually line up with what Paul says about himself. And so then we have to figure out what to do with it. For the most part, we would tend to think, okay, Paul probably knows what happens better than Luke does. But that raises problems in terms of then, what do we do with Luke's other accounts regarding Paul? If there's a discrepancy here, just raises some questions there. And so when it comes to actually trying to figure out, all right, who was Paul and the actual facts around Paul, there's a question mark of how reliable a source is the book of Acts, even as it talks about him. And that comes from the fact that sometimes it contradicts what Paul says about himself, and so it leaves us pretty open-ended. But what I think is really important to understand about Paul is that Paul was very Jewish. We read that in those 2 quotes there. He says that about himself, how important. And Paul doesn't stop being Jewish. There's another book that I whipped out. It's called Paul Was Not a Christian. And it's all about Paul's consistent relationship with Judaism. And so as modern readers of Paul tend to assume the Pharisees and other Jews would have considered Paul an apostate, a Jewish heretic who was no longer part of the Jewish community because of his belief in Jesus, and thus not really Jewish. In the context of the first century, however, Paul's belief in Jesus did not make him any less Jewish, because a messianic savior figure is a very Jewish idea. You keep going, and this is just a completely separate place, but the view of Judaism as a religion in which one is saved by works carries with it several other misconceptions about Judaism. Of most significance, it denies the importance of grace and repentance in Judaism. Grace not only plays a role in early Jewish thinking about salvation, it plays a critical role. God's special relationship to Israel is predicated on grace, not merit. So 2 things here about Paul's Judaism and our relationship with Paul in reading of today. One, we have to take that aspect of who Paul was seriously. Because to understand Paul, you have to understand Paul within the context of his Judaism. Because he tells us that that's really important, and there's no real reason for us to believe that he radically turned from it, particularly when we think about about that idea of the Messiah was not a foreign thing. And we can see how a lot of Paul's work, was within the synagogues and within the Jewish, even as he was the apostle to the Gentiles, he would go to the synagogues and connect with the God-fearers, as they were called, which were Gentiles interested in Judaism, even as they weren't ethnically Jewish. But taking the Jewish part seriously, but also the caution here is that I think much of the understanding of Judaism that Christians have comes through a very Christian lens, like this idea here. Have you ever heard Judaism talked about as, well, you get saved by works. It's all about works, and then we got the New Testament. Jesus came, and there was love and grace. That frame between the two is just patently false. It's just a misconception of Judaism that ends up being really problematic because it really easily leads to some anti-Semitism. But certainly if we're understanding Paul through this misconception about Judaism, then we're going to misunderstand Paul as well. So there's both a need to pay attention to Judaism as part of who Paul was, and an important part of understanding where he's coming from theologically, and a caution when we wade into those waters to make sure that we're actually right in our understanding of Judaism, because there's a lot of misconception stuff that has come from Christian circles. So there's a warning there, I guess, to be cautious, but there's no getting around it.
That's why on your previous chart, I questioned whether, I think we talked about Paul writing Timothy. Timothy's the one that talks about saved by works so much, isn't he?
I don't know how much he talks about saved by works. I wonder if you might be thinking about James. James was the one that Luther had a fit with because he thought he talked too much about being saved by works, and so he called James an epistle of straw.
They all run together in that section.
Yeah. So, just in terms of actual contents, and then we're going to have to write it up, and I'm almost going to make it. But what we got when we're reading Paul is there's letters. And I would just invite you to think about what it means that we are reading letters. Because that's what they are. That one, we're reading the church's mail, so think about it. That's what we're getting. But what we're reading is actually only one half of the conversation. We're getting Paul's words. And Paul is almost always writing in response to a letter. So there's something being written to Paul, and Paul's writing back, but we don't actually know what was written there in the first place. And so we're left to fill in the blanks in the way of this conversation, only hearing half of it, or even less than half, because Paul himself references letters that are getting sent out there that he's sent, but that we don't have access to. So we've got a big hole in the conversation, and we're kind of left to fill in the blank. And one of the things that also happens is that Paul quotes these letters. And there's no quotation marks in ancient Greek. And so we can't actually tell when he's quoting or when he's just writing. And sometimes that makes a significant difference. Like in this one, now concerning the matters about which he wrote. Now if we put up quotation marks here, that becomes very different than if it's as is. Now concerning the matters about which he wrote, it is well for a man not to touch a woman, but because of temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So if Paul's writing that, this is just Paul saying it. If, however, it's, imagine, now concerning the matters about which you wrote, quotation, it is well for a man not to touch a woman. End quote. Paul continues, but because of temptation to immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman. In the first place, Paul ends up having a very negative view of sexuality. It's simply a concession to our humanity. In this case, however, that's not really what Paul's saying, kind of the opposite, actually. He's refuting this point of it is well for a man not to touch a woman. So sometimes these quotation marks and what that looks like is not inconsequential. And we don't know what it is. I don't have the right answer for you, but it's an example. And the larger point is, we're left to construct the context here. And so we read different verses of what's going on, and sometimes it seems to be pretty clear what's happening and what Paul's responding to in these communities, and sometimes far less so. But in any case, they're conversations in a particular context. That what's happening is Paul is trying to address these particular situations as they're popping up. It's a little bit of a game of whack-a-mole. And so what we get from Paul is not his message, as it were. Romans is maybe the closest thing that we get to Paul articulating his theology, because it's pretty substantial. And part of that is that the community in Rome is not one that Paul planted. So he's sort of introducing himself in his message. All of these other churches and letters, they've heard Paul. They know Paul's message. And so Paul says things like, well, you heard the message. Stick to it. What I told you in the first. But he doesn't need to give the message in whole because he already did that. And so what his correspondence actually is it's addressing particular things as they come up. And so that's what we get in Paul, exceedingly contextual writings addressing issues in these first century church communities. Yeah?
Why were these included in the New Testament if they were definitely missing the context for the audience? Why? I mean, unless it feels like a really easy pitfall for literally everyone to fall into.
Mm-hmm.
Because we don't know the other half. So why? My question is, what purpose does this serve if we don't know the rest? If we'll never know the rest because those aren't included or they were lost to time or whatever, right?
If we don't have the full story, what do these texts do? What do they
Why
show?
do I care?
Why do you care? Jack, do you have an answer?
Well, like what you were saying about these are addressing certain points. So were like his teachings like really commonplace sort of thing, and then these were to specific people. So then they're like, so the writers are like, this story, but here's the exclusive on these sort of kind of thing, And then so they didn't include the obvious stuff because, like you said, they're not writing for people 2,000 years later. They're writing for the current people.
Correct. I mean, I think that Paul's letters are exceedingly contextual. They're addressing, very specific situations. But that doesn't mean that they can't still speak and do things today. To answer your question with a question, why do couples include 1 Corinthians in their weddings? Love is patience. Love is kind. I could give you all sorts of different examples. Why do I quote Romans at funerals for we do not grieve as those who have no hope? These stories we've held on to, these letters, not because, they're historical data that give us insight into the community, but because they're living words that continue to speak to people's lives today. We hold on to them because in spite of the shortcomings in these letters, the fact that we don't have half the conversation, the fact that they're very contextual and we don't live in first century Corinth, no doubt there are big holes and limitations to what we have, but we have them and they've been passed on for centuries and centuries, and we can talk about them as the inspired Word of God because of what they continue to do. And so to bring it back to that first paradigm I laid out there, in terms of where they come from, we got all sorts of holes on that level. All sorts of holes and question marks and limitations of what it is. But in terms of what they do, they continue to do a whole lot for a whole lot of people that turn to these texts still today. And that is, I think, what makes them the Word of God.
Does the Bible say we do not grieve those that have no hope?
Yep.
That's where we should grieve the most.
We do not grieve as those who have no hope. I mean, he's affirming that there's grieving. It's just that we don't grieve the loss as if we have no hope because there is hope in life everlasting. That's the point. But, yeah?
Sorry, to follow up. So, does that mean that...
I'm blaming you now for every minute that we go over.
Got it. So the letters, because they were written, within seconds of thinking the thought, there was no, oral passed-down tradition that, could have created some ambiguity.
I think
Can we
that
take letters as much more literal in their...
There is within at least some of the letters pretty good reasons to believe that there's some editing that goes on. Maybe different letters edited together. I mean, we oftentimes will talk about seams, which are kind of just weird transitions, where you're talking about this as a and then you're over there. that's the type of thing that suggests that there's some editing that's going on there. So there's some of that. I don't think that we're not talking about to the extent that we do with the Old Testament, where it's happening over centuries and centuries. Because these get pretty well established fairly early on, as we'll talk about next week. But
Who edited them, and for what reason?
it's a good question. My guess would be, what I think, again, we're talking about 2,000 years ago, so this is all kind of theorizing here. But it's bringing it together in many cases. A lot of times it seems like it's maybe bringing a couple letters that Paul wrote together into one letter. That type of thing taking place. Other times it does seem like maybe you got someone else who's tacking something onto the end, to add some additional thing. So that gets a little messy.
Clarity, perhaps?
Sometimes. I think that there's no doubt that this raises questions, and it makes things difficult. And I'm going to wrap up this up here just for time's sake, and then we can keep talking a little bit. But one of the issues when we recognize how contextual these are, it leads us to this place where, on one hand, they're very contextual, and all the questions that you're asking are legitimate and the ones that biblical scholars, ask. Okay, well, what about this, and what about this, and what about this? There are holes in that where they come from, both. At the same time, we can look at just the way that I said it. There's a reason that these texts continue to speak to people today. They're doing something. There's something that's universal about them that they're able to speak 2,000 years later, in spite of the fact that originally they were written for this people in a very different place. But the question for us then in reading something like this as we're going through, we have to sort through what is contextual and what is universal. Which is to say, what is contextual and maybe doesn't apply to us and is meant for this first century audience, and what is universal and we should read and apply to ourselves in our world today. And there's clearly not agreement always on which one is which. But that is the challenge. This is not easy work, but I don't think that we can ignore the fact that there was a context in the first place, even as that does make it difficult sometimes and raises some new questions. But I think that there's this invitation here, and that's part of the process, to enter into that world, the first century context, and what's going on in the Corinthian church and what's going on in the church in Galatia, and enter into that world. And that by way of doing that, I think that we can get a more deeper, meaningful picture of what's going on and understand and draw more out of it. It goes back to kind of that quote about the Gospels at the beginning, that there's some confusion there. But I think for the most part we wade into and we get this, and it's a worthwhile trade-off, that we end up with a fuller, more meaningful picture of what's going on and what these words are saying and what God can do through them as we understand them more deeply, even as that understanding leads to additional questions and potentially some challenges and confusion.